Well, shalom, my dear friends, and welcome to our Bible study on the book of Genesis. Today we're going to be in chapter 26. And I want to say at the outset that for most Westerners like myself, there's a lot more to prophecy than we're usually taught in our Western culture. For most of us, we have what I learned was called a rectilinear view of prophecy, which means that in an earlier book of the Bible, usually in the Old Testament, a historical event in the future is predicted. And then in a later book of the Bible, usually the New Testament, when that event actually happens, then prophecy is fulfilled. And that is the general view that most Westerners have of prophecy. Now, people who live in the East or the Middle East, where the Bible took place, they also have this rectilinear view of prophecy, but they also understand prophecy as being the repeat of patterns. History is cyclical to the Middle Eastern mind. And today we're going to get a great example of that. And let me share a little bit about that with you up front. If you have been with us through our previous Bible studies on the book of Genesis, when we came to chapter 12, which was shortly after the call of Abraham by God to leave his homeland and come to the promised land, which was then called the land of Canaan because the Canaanites lived there. One of the things that happened in those early days of Abraham and Sarah and their nephew Lot, one of the things that happened was that there was a severe famine in the land. And so they did what people in that region did when famine struck, and that was they went down to Egypt. Because even when most places in the Middle East were suffering famine, Egypt usually did pretty well. Famine was usually produced by a lack of rainfall, so the crops weren't getting enough water, and the people were starving. But in Egypt, they had this blessing of the Nile River, which annually overflowed its banks and provided irrigation. And Egypt could almost always produce plenty of food for the people, unless there was like a divinely sent punishment of famine. So in chapter 12, there was a famine in Canaan, and so Avram and Sarah went down to Egypt to survive, really. And while they were approaching Egypt, Abraham made a request of Sarah, and that is that when they arrived in Egypt, because Abram was convinced that the people who lived in Egypt were going to be pretty immoral, that they didn't believe in the God of the Hebrews, that they would probably put him to death in order to get at his beautiful wife. So the request that Abram made of Sarai was that she tell the Egyptians that he was her brother rather than her husband. And Abram kind of figured the Egyptians are going to have their way with Sarah one way or the other. But this way, if they think I'm her brother, they won't kill me, but they'll let me survive and probably still abuse my wife, which doesn't seem very noble. But that was the pattern that was established there. The interesting thing is that after it was discovered by the Pharaoh that Abram and Sarai were married, he of course expressed his dissatisfaction at this lie that he had been told. But then he sent them out of Egypt, just loaded down with wealth and riches and prosperity, almost kind of a bribe to make them go away. So they went back to Canaan, and they were much wealthier than they were when they had left Canaan because of the famine. And then they went on with their lives until in chapter 20, we discover that Abraham, as a shepherd, as a keeper of flocks and herds, was continually moving around to make sure that his animals had plenty of pasture land. And so he was moving out to the west towards Philistine territory. So he and Sarah once again entered into Gentile territory, Philistine territory, and they met a king of one of the city-states there. His name was Avimelech, and he was the king of the city-state of Gerar, Gerar, I believe. And they told this same story to him because once again, they're in Gentile territory. Avram is afraid that the Gerarites will kill him in order to get at his wife. So they tell the same story. Avimelech eventually finds out that they're married. He too is furious. But this time, Avram and Sarah, now their names are Avraham and Sarah, they explain that technically she is his sister, because although both of them had the same father, they were born of different mothers. So I guess you could call them step siblings. But they were married. I mean, they kind of deceived him about that part. So yeah, he sends them away. In this case, in Gerar, there was no famine, but they also didn't come out with great riches. Although, actually, I think they did come out with great riches both times. I think the riches are implied in Genesis 13 for the first visit to Egypt. And then I believe he does come out with great riches in chapter 20. So you can see the pattern is repeating itself. Now today in chapter 26, they say like father, like son. Isaac and his wife, Rebekah, are going to go to Gerar. They're going to meet the king of the city-state there, and his name is Avimelech. Actually, that's probably not his name. I think all of the kings of the Philistines were called Avimelech. In Hebrew, and probably in Philistine language too, Avimelech means my father is king. So if you're the king's son and you become the king, then your title is my father was the king too. So it's just a succession of the royal line. And we're going to find that Isaac and Rebekah tell the same story, that they're not married, that Isaac is really, and it's for the same reason, because Rebekah is, in the text, it says she's very beautiful. So Isaac fears for his life, so they tell the same story. The pattern has repeated. This will be the third time. Now, if we were doing a Bible study on Exodus, and we might do that at some point. But if we did a study on the book of Exodus, when we come to the story of the Exodus, like in Exodus 14, 15, and 16, and so forth, we discover that after 4 generations of being held as slaves in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, God sends Moses to set the captives free and lead them out of their captivity in Egypt and into the promised land. And the interesting thing is that God tells them before they even come out in the Exodus that they will come out with an abundance of wealth that will be heaped upon them by the Egyptians. And it appears from the text of Exodus that the Egyptians were so eager to see the Israelites go that they gave them all kinds of wealth and stuff like that, silver, gold, precious stones, clothing, cattle, all the riches of Egypt was given to the slave nation so they would go away. They had just come through a series of, I think there are 10 plagues in the early chapters of Exodus. And the citizens of Egypt were so eager to have those plagues over with, and they naturally concluded that the plagues had come upon the Egyptians because of the Israelites, that they wanted the Israelites just to go away so their lives could go back to normal. So the pattern repeats again, and the Israelites come out with wealth and good fortune. And it would almost lead you to the conclusion that lying really pays off, because after you get expelled from the presence of whoever you lied to, you come out with greater wealth. I do not think that is the moral principle that the Bible is trying to tell us. But this is a great example of how biblical prophecy is often cyclical, and it repeats these patterns over and over again, which is just a lesson to those who read the Bible that knowing history is important, because God reveals to us these patterns of how he deals with his people. First of all, I mean, they get into troublesome times. They do whatever they need to do to, try to survive. And then God steps in by his grace and by his power, sets them free from whatever is troubling them. And they come out looking better than they did, before the trials and tribulations started. So that is a consistent pattern of God not only dealing with the chosen people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, but it's also a pattern of the way he deals with us. If you become a believer in Yeshua and you're living for him and you stay in fellowship with God and you're doing the best you can, your life is not necessarily always going to be smooth sailing. You're going to encounter some difficult times. And these are tests that God allows to come into our experience so that we can demonstrate our faith in him and our confidence in him based on what we understand of God's history, his prophetic history of dealing with his people, nations, but also with individuals. And so if we go through trials and tribulations and we remain faithful to God and just pray to him and say, God, I'm counting on you to deliver me from this trial, from this tribulation, God is faithful and he will come through and he will continue to behave in the patterns that he has revealed to us in Scripture. So with that in mind, let's do a little preliminary stuff with our PowerPoint. Once again, here at this point, if you want to avoid the, looking at the maps and the material we've got here, feel free to fast forward the video to the Bible software when we take it up with Genesis 26, verse 1. For those of you who are going to stick with me through the PowerPoint, the last video I started advertising a book that I have written. It took me quite a while to write it. It has just recently gone live, and it's available to you initially on Amazon. It may become available through some other providers. But right now, the best place to get it is on Amazon. It's called Nazarene Essene Theology. The reason I'm advertising it here is because this is my understanding of the theology of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So although it's not specifically about the book of Genesis, a large portion of this book, Nazarene Essene Theology, is a Bible study on the book of Genesis, and probably goes into greater detail than we are going into on these videos. So if you want to get that book, I priced it at $17, so you can get it for that. It's only available in paperback, at least for now. So if you'd like to get that, might help you as we go through these Genesis Bible studies. Once again, this is the dispensational chart. Dispensationalism is a perspective of theology where it looks at the different ages and eras of biblical history and God's unique dealings with people in each one of those. There are a lot of differences between the dispensations, and especially when we go from the Old Testament era into the New Testament era. A lot of significant changes take place on how God deals with believers. This is like, what dispensation is this? This is the fifth study, but I don't think it's the fifth dispensation. Anyway, the dispensations are innocence, the age of innocence, the age of conscience, the age of human government, I believe it is. Then the age of promise. So this would be the fourth age that we're in now. God has been making promises all through the book of Genesis, all through the historical dispensations up to this point. But in this period of history that we're looking at on the chart, making of promises, especially to this chosen group of people, is the most important thing that God is doing. He's made promises before, he will make promises after this. But this age is characterized by the promises and the covenants that are shaped around those promises in God's dealing with people. We've got our red line of redemption, the road of redemption that goes all the way through this period of history, and it goes right through the family of Avram, who's later called Avraham, Yitzhak, and he's the one we're studying now. One of his sons will be, actually, he's already been born, that is Yaakov, and his name will be changed to Israel, which will later become the name of the nation that God had promised this family would become. The red line passes through his son Judah, the Messiah. Yeshua was from this family of Judah. And then it goes down to Egypt. And in the latter chapters of the book of Genesis, we will talk about Joseph's adventures in Egypt. And of course, he's not the only one having adventures because there's a famine in the land of Canaan. And so the rest of his family goes down to Egypt, pattern repeating. Okay, we've got some maps here that we've looked at. This is the first map in the atlas that I have and I'm making use of here. And it talks about the initial call of God on Abraham, tells him to get out of the place where he was born was Ur of the Chaldeans. Not sure exactly what age it was when they left there, kind of followed the Euphrates River up to a place called Haran. In this would be like modern day Syria. Padan Aram is kind of the Fertile Crescent here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then when Avram is, I think it's 75 years old when he leaves Haran, travels down into the land that was then known as Canaan. It's the promised land. And I'd like to show you this map because this red path kind of illustrates the dimensions of the promised land. In Genesis 13, God says that he will give to Abraham and his descendants all of the land upon which they walk and all of the land that their eyes behold. So seeing land, walking on land signifies ownership for them. So they own all this land. Abraham saw it, walked on it, and then in Genesis 15, the geographical boundaries of the promised land are defined. It's from the river of Egypt, which I would take to be the Nile, and to the great river, the river Euphrates, which starts up here somewhere, runs all the way down here. So you can see that the promised land constitutes a very large portion of the Middle East. This is the follow-up map, and I like this one because it shows the trek down to Egypt, which we've already talked about in Genesis chapter 12. Avram and Sarai go down there, then they come back with all the wealth of Egypt and so forth. And then, this is all part of the promised land. It includes the land of Goshen, which is up here in the Delta area. So then they go back to the promised land, the land of Canaan. And then I have blown up that previous map, so we're seeing just that part of it. So we can see a little more clearly some of the major events in the life of Abraham. Really, this map is kind of outdated now because none of the events in Isaac's life are mentioned, and he's the main character now. But this map is good for us because like Abraham and Sarah, Isaac is going to go to Gerar. He's going to go there with his wife and his two kids, his twin sons, Esau and Yaakov. So they're going to go to Gerar, spend some time there, and then leave and come back to the area of Beersheba. So here's where Gerar is. I'm not sure when, like what date you're going to be watching this video, but as I'm making this video, there is a war raging in Israel in the Gaza Strip. And I wanted to point out to you on the map that here is the city of Gaza, and the Gaza Strip would include like this area that I'm outlining. I'm going too far inland. This that I'm outlining now with the pointer. This is the Gaza Strip. This was Philistine territory in the biblical era, and I think 4 of the 5 cities are labeled here: Gerar, Gaza, Ashdod, Ekron, and I can't remember the other one, which one's being left out. Anyway, this is the Gaza Strip. It was the land of the Philistines, and the people who are fighting the Israelis in the Gaza Strip now call themselves the Palestinians. Palestinian and Philistine are the same word in Hebrew, Palestin. And it was actually the modern day Palestinians are making kind of a false claim to that title because they are not the descendants of the ancient biblical era Philistines. They are Middle Easterners. Most of them are Arabs. The Philistines came from Europe, maybe Crete or some of the islands in the Aegean Sea. So they were Europeans. And so the people who are living there now are not descendants of those Europeans. And the Philistines were wiped out by David, and there was mainly by David when he was king. So I mean, there are no Philistines living in that territory after that time. Basically, the Philistines who lived there ceased to exist thousands of years ago. So yeah, I guess that's all we need to say about that. I have been referring to Hebrews 11, like starting at verse 8 and running through verse 19, because it tells of all the examples of Abraham and Sarah living by faith. Isaac is mentioned in verse 17 as the object of sacrifice that God commanded him to make. And then we talked, that's Genesis 22, and then we talked about the divine drama depiction of God accepting a substitute for the sinful Isaac, who deserved to die for his sins, but God accepted a lamb which had been, or a ram rather, caught by its horns in the thicket. A ram can be a sheep or a goat. And just really kind of a detailed chancel drama, for lack of a better term, of the atonement of the Messiah. Messiah was offered on the same hill, same location. A lot of the details are the same. Then Isaac disappears for a while after that event until he is reunited with his bride. His dad sends the servant Eleazar up to Syria to get a bride. Turns out to be Rebecca. Brings her back home, and we kind of take up the story from there. Last time, I think it was the last time I started looking at the family tree of the chosen people. It starts with Terah, who was Avram's father. Abram's brothers were Nahor and Haran. Haran died before reaching the city of Haran, spelled a little bit differently. And here is Sarai, who was Terah's daughter by a mother other than Avram's daughter. Then Hagar enters into the scene when Sarai suggests that Avram and Hagar sleep together, produce a child. That child is Ishmael, who is the ancestor of the Ishmaelites. Eventually, Abraham and Sarah have the promised child after 25 years of waiting. When he's 100, she's 90, Isaac is born. He's the promised child. Ishmael is banished from the household, and Isaac becomes totally the heir, H-E-I-R. When the bride is chosen for Isaac, it turns out to be Rebecca, whose family tree can also be traced back here. So her father's name is Bethuel, who is of the same generation as Isaac. And then his father was Nahor, who was Avram's brother. So Bethuel is Isaac's generation. Rebecca is the next generation. So since Rebecca is the child of Isaac's cousin, I guess she would be a second cousin. I don't really understand like the labels we put on family trees. But anyway, this depicts the relationship. So Isaac and Rebecca are related at whatever level this is, and they marry. So they had a relationship even before they got married, but now they have the married relationship. So I guess you could say there's no excuse for them to lie about their marriage relationship. And then, of course, in the last chapter or two, we had the birth of Yaakov and Esav. These two are twins. And so I guess that's all we need to look at there. This is a picture of a biblical era well. This particular one is in the city of Megiddo. It's actually a tell, which is a kind of a heaped up area of land where one culture after another was conquered and destroyed, and then the conquerors built another city on top. So Megiddo has, I forget how many layers, it's like 19 layers or something. And this is an ancient biblical era well. And the reason I'm showing you this picture is because, again, as Westerners, we usually have a certain concept of a well, like I have in the side yard of my house, which is a little white pipe sticking up out of the ground. That's a well, a modern well. If you go back to the pioneer days and the little house on the prairie days, people had wells that, I don't know, might have been 10 or 12 feet in diameter, and they dug down deep until they hit water. And then there would be, like, they would lower a bucket on a hand crank down into the well. And there's usually like a little roof or an awning that's built over it. And then you lower the water down with a hand crank. Well, that's not the way they did it in the biblical era. This is this that I'm pointing to now is a circular stairwell that goes down into the well. And the way a person would draw water would be to walk down the stairwell with his containers for water until he hit the water level. And then I say she, it was usually women who drew the water, would draw the water out and then walk back up the stairway. This is a huge hole in the ground. This might be, I don't know, 20 or 30 or maybe 50 foot in diameter. We have a stairwell here. Of course, the opening at the top would be larger than that. So these wells had to be dug by hand, maybe with the assistance of animals or, whatever. But it was a big undertaking to dig a well. I mean, you didn't do this in a short period of time. It took a long time, like for a landowner and his servants to dig out these wells. So if something happens to the well, as we're going to read about today, it's serious business, because living out there in the Negev, the southern desert region where Isaac was living, if somebody messed with your water supply, that was serious. You wouldn't survive there. You would have to move to a place where there would be water, and maybe that implied digging more wells. So keep that in mind as we go through the text today. So now we are ready to dive into the text. We've spent about a half hour on preliminary material. Genesis 26:1, there was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. That's the one in Genesis 12. The one in Genesis 20, where Abraham and Sarah go to Gerar, there's no famine mentioned. There's no famine mentioned there. And Yitzhak went to Avimelech, king of the Palestine, in Gerar. Now, I think part of what's going on here is Abraham was very wealthy, had huge numbers of flocks and herds, had a lot of wealth. So it required a lot of territory to provide pasture land for Abraham's flocks and herds. Well, Isaac inherits that. So he's got the wealth, he's got the flocks and herds. So he needs to keep moving west. So even though there's not a famine, he's getting nearer and nearer to Gerar. So I think his growth in his prosperity just brings him close to Gerar. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. So why would God say that? Well, it may be because Isaac knew the story of Abraham and Sarah going down to Egypt and how they came out wealthy. So it might have occurred to him to do the same thing that his father did. God makes it clear to him that God does not want him to go to Egypt, but apparently he does allow him to go to Gerar with this Philistine king of a city-state. Those other Philistine cities, Ekron and Gath, and Gath is the one that wasn't on the map, I think, and so forth. There were kings of each one of those cities, and they may have been called Avimelech. I'm sure that's a title rather than a name. So God tells him not to go down to Egypt, but dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. This is a repetition and a kind of a confirmation of the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham repeatedly. Chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 17, and so forth. Now Isaac is the man in charge. Abraham and Sarah are gone. They've gone to their eternal reward. Now Isaac is having the covenant renewed with him. Another thing that's happening here is God is saying, things may look bad for you, but you can trust me. You can trust me. I want you to believe in me that I will provide for you. I will make sure that you keep this land. I'll make sure to provide you with all you need, your daily bread. I'll keep my promises to you. I'll provide, housing for you, whatever you need. God says I will provide it. And the same message can be applied to us as we go through our lives, fellowship with God, believing in him, allowing him to transform our lives by the renewing of our minds, by the indwelling Holy Spirit, and by the word of God. We will encounter trials and tribulations, and when we do, we need to trust in God, just like Abraham did, just like Isaac did, just like all the Bible heroes did. And God was faithful, and he did get them through those tough times, and he did provide for them and, bless them beyond their wildest imaginations. So that's what God is telling Isaac to do in this situation. He says, I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. We've heard that before. And I will give to your descendants all these lands, part of the promised land, everything from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And in your seed or your descendant, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. I believe in Genesis, every reference to the word seed in Hebrew is singular, like this one is. If you look at the information window at the bottom of the page, it tells you that the root word is zerah. It's the Hebrew word for seed. And it can be, depending on the way the vowels are arranged, it can be either singular or plural. In this case, it is a singular thing. What God is promising here is that he will bless the ultimate seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Messiah, Yeshua, and give him this land. And through him, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, for each succeeding generation of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I mean, all the way through the time of Yeshua and beyond, God is still keeping his covenant with the chosen people, with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it may not look like it in these days in which we are living, because, I mean, the primary reason is because when Yeshua came, his own people failed to recognize him, with the exception of people like the Essenes and the Nazarenes, who were experts on prophecy and recognized Yeshua as the fulfillment of those prophecies. But because that chosen people brought about the death, actually the murder of their Messiah, they have suffered for 2 generations, 2 millennia. But the Bible makes it clear that there is a time coming in the future. This is rectilinear prophecy, when they will look upon Yeshua when he returns in power and great glory, and then they will recognize him for who he is. In the meantime, more and more Jews are recognizing Yeshua as their Messiah, their Savior, and they are becoming what we call Messianic Jews. The Messianic movement is growing by leaps and bounds these days. And it's been a pretty rapid growth, a pretty sudden growth of that movement. And that's certainly an encouragement. In Galatians chapters 3 and 4, the Apostle Paul makes a big deal out of the fact that in Genesis, all the references to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are in the singular, and that's a reference to Yeshua. Okay, verse 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So God accepts us as we are, sinners though we are, but he loves us too much to leave us that way. And he invests his life, he indwells us by his Holy Spirit. He gives us his word so that we can become people who will obey his voice and keep his charge and his commandments, statutes, and laws. For us, it's not the laws of the Old Testament like the law of Moses, but it's the law of the Messiah. It's the law of Yeshua that he gives in the Sermon on the Mount and so forth. But keep in mind that for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even the 12 sons of Jacob, they were not the recipients of the law of Moses. They lived before that. So in a way, our lives as New Testament, New Covenant believers living under the law of Messiah, we are going back to the era of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and living in kind of the same way they were. They didn't have a Bible yet. They were living by, God communicating to them through their conscience, giving them his charge, his commandments, statutes, and laws internally in their hearts and minds. So, verse 6, Isaac dwelt in Gerar. And the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful. She is Tova. She's very good looking. Good looking to behold. Mare, she is. Tov. This is actually in the Tov. The word Tov is good, or pleasant, or beautiful. And it's in the construct case in Hebrew, which means you put the word of after it. So she was good of appearance, Mare. Okay. So she's good looking. They tell their little lie. Isaac hopes that he will survive because he told this little white lie. Now it came to pass, verse 8, when he had been there a long time. Now that's interesting, because if you didn't make note of that, that they stayed in Gerar for quite a while, um, you would think that like this, that what happens next happened right away after their arrival, but it didn't. They'd been there a long time. What is it? Well, a length of days, it says. And let me just suggest what I think is going on here. We learned from the book of Esther that one of the things that kings often did was that they collected beautiful women in their harems. And they didn't start abusing them sexually right away. They would usually have them groomed. They would take baths all the time so they smelled beautiful and they looked lovely, and they had all these, the makeup artists and stuff like that. They would be taught the culture because a lot of them were foreign girls. Like Esther was a foreign girl. She was in the harem of a Persian king, a Medo-Persian king, and she had come from Israel, so she needed to learn the culture, learn how to behave in in the royal courtyard. And it took some time to do that. I think it was a matter of years for Esther. So I don't know how long Rebecca had been in the good graces of Avimelech, the king of Gerar, but she was probably being groomed to eventually sleep with him and provide him some pleasure, along with probably lots of other girls in that harem. So I think the time that passed then would be a time of preparation for her. So I don't think she has been spoiled yet. So they'd been there a while. She's probably being groomed to be suitable for the king's pleasures. That Avimelech, and again, his name means my father is king, a title, probably rather than a first name. He was the king of the Palishtim. It doesn't say just the king of Gerar, so maybe the time had come for one king to rule all the Philistines. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, Avimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw, and there was Yitzhak showing endearment to Rivka, his wife. Let's do a little word study here. Showing endearment. I've got the word endearment highlighted, and if we go over to our Hebrew text here is the word. The Hebrew word is metzahek. Metzahek. The word right next to it is Isaac's name, and that is Yitzhak. Those two may sound kind of similar because the root word Sadi Chet Kesh, Kuf, and the root of his name, Sadi Chet Kuf, are the same. It's the same root word. The mem or im prefix here kind of display, what would that, it's a participial form, but it's kind of a verbal noun is what it is. And one of the characteristics of a verbal noun is a mem prefix. Over here, the yod prefix is like the first letter of Yitzhak's name. So the yod has been replaced by a mem here. This is a behavior. Now, we learned when Isaac was born, actually, we learned before he was born, that when Abraham and Sarah received a divine visitation, what would this be, chapter 18? God announced to them that this time next year, Sarah was going to have this promised child. And both of them laughed. Abraham at that point, probably laughed in a way that was more acceptable to God, kind of a laughter of joy and hope and expectation. But apparently, based on God's reaction to Sarah's laugh, uh, her laugh might have been a laugh of skepticism, doubt, like just kind of almost mocking what God had said, because she was rebuked for her laugh. Since both of them laughed, God ordained that the name of the child would be Yitzhak, which means laughter, and we learned that back then. But the word sahak also has a lot of derived meanings from that. If the root word means laughter, sahak also means funny. I think comedians in modern day Israel are called tsahakim or tsahakot, probably depending on their gender. Um, when Isaac was born and was a young child, I think his brother was like 10 years older than he was. Ishmael was 10 years older. And the Bible says that Ishmael was tsahaking Isaac. And our English translation is that he was mocking him. He was maybe not laughing with him, but laughing at him, making fun of him, disrespecting him. So this word can mean a lot of stuff. Well, here we get in our text for today, it's translated with the word endearment. I think the King James uses the term playing, that Isaac and Rebekah were playing. But if they were playing, and I think tzahak is a Hebrew word that means playing. But they were doing so in a way that that showed that what they had told him about their relationship was not true. So they were playing or laughing or teasing or treating each other in a way that Avimelech realized right away that they were not brother and sister, that the way they were behaving would be inappropriate for brothers and sisters, but completely natural and characteristic of married couples. So just an interesting thing about the name Yitzhak and the verbal root tzahak. It means a lot of different stuff. Over in the Dake Study Bible here, he gives a lot of different ideas. Laugh outright, to play, to make sport. We've already talked about teasing or tormenting or mocking. So it has lots of different meanings, and some of them are like opposite. Some of them are really good ways to treat people, and some of them are mean and inappropriate ways to treat people. So the context really tells us a lot about what these Hebrew words mean. So the jig is up. Avimelech knows that these two are married. So then Avimelech called Yitzhak and said, quite obviously, she is your wife. So how can you say she is my sister? So, Isaac and Rebekah are busted. So Yitzhak said to him, because I said, in other words, I said to myself, I said to my wife, lest I die on account of her. And that's the reason he did it. It's not going to get him out of trouble. And Avimelech said, what is this you have done to us? One of the people, and I would say that would be the people in his court that would have access to the women in the harem. One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, in other words, had sex with her, and you would have brought guilt on us. Now, this brings up the interesting question about how the Philistines, who weren't believers in the God of the Bible, or maybe they were. They had lived in close proximity to Abraham and Sarah for a long period of time. Maybe they saw the God of Israel or the God of the Hebrews at work in their lives. Maybe he became a believer in the God of Israel. Maybe he just had good moral standings. Who were the Philistines and where did they come from? Well, if I were going to date this event, I would make it, approximately the year 1000. David comes along in the year 2000. I'm sorry, the other way around. Abraham would be 2000 BC, uh, before the Common Era. Um, and then David would be like 1000 before the Common Era. So this is long before the time of we said the Philistines came from like a Greek culture, but it's an ancient Greek culture. It's a culture about 1500 years before the classic Greek culture was prominent in the world. 500 BC was the time of the pantheon of the gods. So, what gods the Philistines had, we know at a later time, not so far distant a time, that the Philistines were worshiping the god Dagon, which is a fish god. They worshipped Baal. They worshipped. They had the Asherah poles and so forth. So these were foreign gods. But even though these were false gods, a lot of these religious systems had standards of morality. So, the thing um, that Avimelech and the people who lived in Gerar would have been reluctant to do would be to have sex with a married woman. Even they knew that was adultery and they wouldn't do it. Um, but you know, they were going to do it with a man's sister, and wouldn't have necessarily been married to her. So they have some morality going on here, because Avimelech is saying, if I would have slept with your wife or somebody else from our country, we would have been guilty. We would have brought guilt on us. And then either the God or the Bible, or the God of the Hebrews, or one of our own gods would punish us for that because it's morally wrong. I mean, even if you look at some of the territories in the Middle East that are just barbaric as far as their behavior is concerned. I mean, the attacks on Israelites on October 7th of 2023 were so horrific, so barbaric. Um, Atrocity, it just isn't a good enough word. But those are Muslims, and they have moral standards, and sometimes their moral standards are more strict than Western American kind of natural law standards. Christians have high standards too. Jewish people have high standards too. But I'm just saying that even the Philistines have moral standards because of whatever religion they participate in. So yeah, let's see. So Avimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death," because he doesn't want the wrath of the gods or God being visited on him. So he's going to send them away. So he sends them away untouched, unharmed. No mention of wealth and riches at this point. So they go away, and Isaac sowed in the land, and he reaped the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. So even if the Gerarites had blessed him with wealth and riches and so forth, ultimately it's the Lord who is responsible for our prosperity. And I imagine he wasn't that far away from Gerar. He probably left the city confines, but he was out in the country taking care of his flocks and herds. Verse 13, the man, we're talking about Yitzhak, began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. So the word is gadal, which means to enlarge or to become great. And let's see. That's a different word. Oh, Ha'ish vayeled haloch gadol. There's gadol again, and here's gadol again. Me'od, very prosperous. So the word gadol is repeated there 3 times. That's how prosperous he became. For he had possessions of flocks, possessions of herds, and a great number of servants. Maybe more so than when he entered the Philistines. He may have gotten flocks and herds from them. He may have gotten servants from them. But anyway, he's got a house full of servants, and he's got a lot of flocks and herds, so that the Philistines envied him. This is one of the problems that God's chosen people, whether it's Jews or Christians, have, because if they are devout believers and if they live the way God wants them to, if they do what they need to do to maintain their fellowship with God, God will bless them in such extraordinary ways that people who aren't believers will look at them and become jealous. Now, people who look at those who are being prospered by God can react in one of 2 ways. First of all, they can get angry and attack them, which is what these Gerarites, these Philistines, are going to do. Or they can say, whatever that guy's got, I want some of it. So I'm going to go have a talk with him, and maybe I can get in on whatever he's got going with his God who is blessing him so well. One, I guess, is called evangelism. The other is called persecution. So the Philistines envied Yitzhak and Rivka and their 2 boys, Yaakov and Esau. Now, the Palestine, the Philistines, had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father. Remember, Abraham and Sarah had been to Gerar, had been blessed by them. Abraham's servants dug these wells, like the picture that we saw in the preliminary material, huge wells. Wouldn't necessarily have to be as big as that one is in Megiddo, but I mean, that would be an example of a biblical era well. So the Philistines become jealous and they fill up the well. So, in other words, like they start throwing stones in the well, I guess, until it's filled up and, can't be used anymore by Isaac. So they filled them up with earth. And Avimelech said to Yitzhak, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. So, I get the impression at the beginning of this chapter that the Philistines are more powerful than Isaac, but now Isaac has become so powerful that the Philistines don't want him living close by them anymore. You're much mightier than we. Atzmeta mimenu. Ki atzamta. Etzem is like the word for bones. But I guess the bones in your body are like the strong part of your body. So here it's used as a way of talking about strength. Okay. So you're mightier than we are. Then Yitzhak departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, obviously further away than they were before, and he dwelt there. And Yitzhak dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham, his father. Now, I don't know if this means that, like, the Philistines had filled up those wells and then he opened them up again, or if he dug new wells like his father Abraham did in his own days, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. So yeah, I guess that's what it is. These were wells that had been dug by Abraham. As he moved around to different places, he dug wells in these locations, and then the Philistines go fill them all up. He called them by the names which his father had called them. Also, Yitzhak's servants dug in the valley. So he's got lots of servants. He's got lots of shovels out there, a lot of manpower. So Yitzhak's servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there. So that's a good thing. It sounds like a new well. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. Now, it says here clearly that Isaac's herdsmen, his servants, dug these wells, but the guys from Gerar claimed them. So he called the name of the well Esek, Ayin Sin Kuf, which is the Hebrew word for, it would be like contention or opposition, accusation, strife or contention, because they quarreled with him. They quarreled with him. Then they dug another well and they quarreled over that one also. So the reason I showed you that picture is I wanted to impress upon you what a big deal and what a lot of work went into digging these wells. And then you got the Philistines come along and fill them up, and you can't use them. Or if you dig a new one, then they claim it to be their own. So that's the hostility that's going on here. So he called this one Sitna, which is kind of a synonym. It would be Sin Tet Noon, Sitna, with a hay on the end. And that means opposition or accusation. And he moved from there and dug another well. So what is that? 3 new wells dug? And they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehovot. Rehovot. And Rehovot means wide places. A Rahav is the name for like a street, like a city street, because it's wide. It's not like a narrow one-lane path. A Rahav is like a main traffic route. The basic root means wideness, wide places. So I think what Isaac is saying here is, I have found some wide open territory. The Philistines aren't bothering me. I've got a well dug here, so I got plenty of water for the people that live here with me and for all the flocks. So Rehovot is what he called it, wide places. For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Then from there he went up from there to Beersheba. Beersheba means the well, or the spring. The well of Sheva is a promise, and we're going to learn about the promise in the following verses here. Verse 24, and Yahweh, Adonai. When we come across this word in the Bible, sometimes I at least like to mention that I believe the proper pronunciation of the sacred name of God is Yahweh. In the book that I was advertising earlier in the preliminary stuff, I have a whole section here on how we can know God's name, but whether or not we should pronounce it or not. The Jewish people during the Second Temple era did not pronounce the name of God. And even in the Bibles we have today, we have the consonants, Yod He Vav He, for the sacred name, but the vowels that are included in our scholarly Hebrew Bibles are the vowels for the title Adonai, which means my Lord. So that is why the sacred name of God appears in our English Bibles with the word Lord, because that's what Adonai means. So when the Jews come across that in the text, instead of saying Yahweh, they say Adonai, because they say it should never be pronounced. And they're pretty conscientious about not pronouncing it, but either pronouncing it Adonai, which means Lord, or Elohim, which means God, but they don't say his name. You could make an argument that for the Jews to not pronounce the name because they think it might be mispronounced, when they say Adonai, they know that's not what his sacred name is, so that's an intentional mispronouncement of it. And I think the practice of the apostles after the time of Yeshua, I guess the question about whether or not to pronounce the name would maybe fall upon Yeshua. The question, what would Jesus do? Would he pronounce the name or not? We don't know if he pronounced it or not. In our Bibles, our New Testaments, it's recorded as the Greek word kurios, which is the Greek word for Lord. So the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and then the New Testament documents that were written in Greek, they all use kurios. They don't even use the four sacred letters. So they make that substitution, and that was the practice that the followers of Jesus used. So I think you could make the argument based on that that it's better to use the circumlocution, or to say Adonai or Hashem, which means the name, instead of the sacred name of God, because that was the practice that the apostles of Yeshua followed. But at the same time, that practice didn't begin until the Second Temple era, which was like the first or the last 300 years of the Old Testament era, and then the first 100 years of the first 70 years of the of AD, or the Common Era. So in all the Old Testament era, up until the last few books, the sacred name of God was pronounced. I think there's no doubt about that. That substitution didn't begin until much later. And, it was a well-meaning, conscientious way to avoid taking the Lord's name in vain. But then they don't get to hear it pronounced, and they don't get to be blessed by hearing his name. Like even in the blessing from Numbers chapter 6, they say Adonai. They don't say the Lord's name, Yahweh, even though the instruction to the Levitical priests was to say the Lord's name, to place the Lord's name on the people. Okay, enough of that little sideline there. So Yahweh, or Adonai, appeared to him, to Yitzhak, the same night, and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So he, Yitzhak, built an altar there and called on the name of Yahweh. So what name did he call on? Did he call on the name of Yahweh, or did he refer to him as Adonai? Well, at this point in history, I think he called on the name. So actually, what the Hebrew text here is saying, Yikara, he was calling in Shem, in the name Yahweh, or proclaiming. He was proclaiming in the name of Yahweh. So I don't know, that sounds like the name was pronounced, but we don't want to offend any Jewish people here, so we'll probably just say Adonai to avoid offending them when we don't need to. So he called on the name of Adonai. He pitched his tent there, and there Yitzhak's servants dug a well. How many wells is this? 3 or maybe 4 wells that they've been digging in a short period of time. Then Avimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzat, one of his friends. Let's see here. Ahuzat, Mereyehu, Upichal Sar Sava. Oh, I know what was interesting here. Ahuzat, this guy's name in Greek is Akhozat. Pretty close. And it says he was the Nymphagogos. And if you look at the information window down at the bottom of the page, that means best man. I don't know. This is the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. Now, I don't know if this is accurate, that Ahuzat was Avimelech's best man, like at his wedding, but it's one of his friends. And then Fichol, the commander of his army, his tzava. And Yitzhak said to them, why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you? In other words, like, why are you pursuing me? You told me to go away because you hate me. So I went away, and I'm doing fine here by myself, so why are you chasing after me? But they said, we have certainly seen that Adonai is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us and between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. So before we said there are two ways that unbelievers can deal with believers when they see God prospering the believers. They can either say, I want a piece of that pie, so let's get in good with the believers so we can get some of the fallout of the blessings, the overflow. Or you can treat it with hostility and persecution, which is what they did initially. So I'm guessing that the more they filled in Isaac's wells, the more God prospered Isaac. And they saw that their persecution wasn't working. So what? If you can't beat them, join them, right? So we've certainly seen that Adonai is with you. So we said, let there be an oath, an agreement, a covenant between us, between you and us. And let us make a covenant, a berit, with you, that you will do us no harm. Remember, they were afraid that, Isaac and his household was getting more powerful than Gerar or maybe all the Philistines put together. So you'll do us no harm, since we have not touched you, other than filling in your wells in the past. And since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. Like we could have killed you when you lied to us about your wife, but we let you live, and now God's prospering you. You are now blessed of Adonai. So he made them a feast. If that's what you do, if you're going to make a covenant, you have a meal that kind of seals the covenant. So they ate and they drank. Then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another. And Yitzhak sent them away, and they departed from him in peace, having made a covenant with them. Now, we don't know the terms of the covenant. It sounds like just an agreement not to harm each other. We're going to, let live and let live, kind of a thing there. So, verse 32, it came to pass the same day that Yitzhak's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug. And they said to him, we have found water. So he felt blessed. So he called it Sheva. Sheva is the Hebrew word for a promise or an oath. Therefore, the name of the city near where that well was is Beersheba. So the city of Beersheba is called, its name means the well of the promise. And this agreement that was made with Abimelech and the Philistines and the people near him from Gerar, that's the reason that still surviving city, Beersheba, is still on the map, still prospering today down there near the Gaza Strip. Now, the scene shifts from Yitzhak to one of his sons, Esav. Esav was 40 years old, and he took as wives Yehudit, the daughter of Beeri. Now, I don't know if there's any significance to this, but Yehudit is a girl's name that means a Jewess, somebody from the tribe of Judah. Now, I don't know. I mean, obviously, it didn't have significance to the tribe of Judah because Judah hasn't been born yet. I mean, so this wouldn't be a reference to Judah or his tribe or the later Jewish people. So, like I say, I don't know if there's any significance to this name, but the gal he marries is Yehudit. An English, well, it would be Judith or Judy in English. And her dad's name was Beeri the Hittite. Beeri the Hittite. So Esau married a Canaanite girl, a Hittite girl. And Basmat, the daughter of Elon ha-Hittite. And Elon was, I think, part of the family of the Hittites, from whom Abraham bought the burial plot, the Oaks of Mamre, and the what's the word for cave? The burial cave on that land. And those Canaanite girls, were a grief to the mind of Yitzhak and Rivka. Now, remember how important it was to Abraham and Sarah that their son Isaac marry a Bible-believing girl, although there wasn't a Bible in those days, a God-fearing girl. And they figured the best place to find a God-fearing girl would be in their extended family up in Haran in Syria, or Aram. And so they sent the servant up there to, Sarah had passed away already. Abraham sent the servant up there to make sure that Isaac didn't marry a Canaanite girl. So Isaac, learned about that you don't want the Hebrews intermarrying with the Canaanite girls because they're kind of under God's judgment. So so these Canaanite girls in the family are a source of grief, Morah, which means bitterness. They were bitter about these girls that Esav had married. And Esau is going to take this kind of personally. So, Jacob's going to marry a girl from the family, but mom and dad don't approve of his wife. So, next Bible study is going to be on Genesis chapter 27. This is going to be the story of Jacob kind of cheating his brother out of his inheritance. He prompted Esau to sell his birthright. What chapter was that in? Was that 25 or 24? Esau came in from the fields. He'd been out hunting. He was starving. He thought he was going to die. So Jacob is cooking a stew there. And so Esau wants some of the stew. So Jacob basically sells it to him for his birthright. But then he wants the blessing, he wants the blessing that normally would have come to the firstborn, Esau. Jacob wants it. So he's going to kind of maneuver to get it. Now, the interesting thing, our Bible study for today, I came across a description of those two boys where it talks about the fact that Esav was like an outdoorsman. He was a hunter, a real he-man. And Yaakov was kind of a quiet guy. And the Hebrew word that is used to describe Yaakov is tam, which is often translated perfect, with the sense of moral perfection, like not just a guy who had faith, but a man of faith, characterized by faith and moral uprightness. And I thought, boy, that doesn't sound like Jacob. I mean, he's like, he cheats his brother out of his birthright, and then he cheats him out of his blessing. But in actuality, what Jacob was doing was fulfilling prophecy, because when Rebekah was pregnant, she had inquired of the Lord for the struggle that was going on with the twins in her womb. And God had said, the older will serve the younger. In other words, Esau would serve Jacob. So in a sense, he was just playing out prophecy. He was doing maybe what he considered necessary in order to do this. And actually, we'll find that Jacob is reluctant to go through this scheme to try to get the blessing that was naturally due to Esau. He was afraid it wouldn't work, and he was afraid he would be cursed because of it. But it was Rebekah's idea to do this. And she is the one who had heard the prophecy that the older would serve the younger. So she may have felt compelled to come up with a scheme so that her son, the younger, or the one she preferred at least, would get the blessing. So we'll talk more about that in the next Bible study. Let me give you a New Testament blessing today. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. In Yeshua's name, Amen. Hope you'll be with us for our next study on Genesis 27.